sort of like manually checking back statements or month by month, you know?
Okay, potentially anyone on that end? Can anyone else hear that fuzzy microphone? Okay, not sure who that might be.
There's a few different accounts in here. So maybe that's a little easier.
I'm not sure. It might just be
For expensive
chatter.
or revenue?
Whenever, John, if you want to kick off the meeting, or I'm not sure how you want to.
Well, we should be starting with Jacques as the chair, or Emily. Is Emily there?
Emily's not here.
I think on the agenda, it looked like Emily would be chairing.
Yeah, she is going to chair. That's true. She's not here yet.
Not to interrupt, but John, if you would just mute your mic a second, we have some strange buzz going on. I wonder if it is you. Your mic is buzzing quite a bit. I'm not sure if you have a different audio possibility.
Now?
That's better.
I didn't do anything.
It miraculously went away whenever you did.
It
Or
did.
didn't do.
Yeah, I would think Jacques could probably start if he wants to.
Okay, let me, I will open this joint meeting of the Moab, or of the Grand County, of the Grand County Commission and the Grand County Planning and Zoning Commission as well. And I will turn it over to John.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Adler. And I don't know, we don't really have a quorum here, I think, for either side. I'm not sure, I'm just checking, but we don't need one necessarily because this is an information exchange primarily. It's always nice to have a quorum, of course, but middle of the day, sometimes hard to do. So I think everyone should know each other. You might have some people on here that may not be aware of who is here, and you might have somebody in the room there, the commission chambers. I see there's somebody, I see the back of their head anyway. I don't know who that is. So we may want to do introductions just to start off. I should just say that this is a session focused on land use strategies. It is our second major workshop other than the public sessions that we've had. This one is more of the watershed week, I would call it. There's a workshop today, and then on Wednesday and Thursday, Bill is coming to town, Bill Grimes is, and we'll be having neighborhood meetings focused somewhat on land use, but also just general feedback from people in the area. We're going to bring some maps of discrete neighborhoods for discussion. And but Bill is going to be bringing strategies from this meeting today. So this is an important kind of reference point for the commissions to give us some input. And it's not the last chance you have. There's going to be more. So Jacques, if you're okay, I wouldn't mind just doing a roundtable just to see if everyone knows each other. So John Gunther, Planning and Zoning Director, over to you, Jacques.
Jacques Hadler, the Grand County Commission Chairman. I guess let's start with everyone on Zoom if we could. So yeah.
You want to go to Steve?
Hey everyone, Steve Evers, Planning Commissioner.
You have to pass the ball, Steve.
Oh geez, where are my screens? I'm gonna pass it to Josie Kovash. Could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, Josie Kovash, County Commissioner. I'm gonna pass it on to Tony.
You're muted, Tony. Tony, if you can hear me, unmute.
Oh. Sorry about that, guys. And also, sorry, I look completely chaotic. I just got out of work. We're working in the field today. My name is Tony Mancuso. I'm on the Planning Commission.
And pass the ball to?
I see William Grimes. I don't believe we've met.
We haven't, Tony, but thank you. Bill Grimes with SCJ Alliance. I'm a consultant working with the county on the land use element. And I will pass it off to Josh Green.
Josh Green I'm the compliance officer with the Planning and Zoning Office, and I'll pass it down to Lauren.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, hi, Lauren Booker, Vista with the Planning Department.
Yeah, and I mean, people.
And I'll pass it to Chris Baird.
Hi, everybody. This is Chris Baird. I'm the Grant County Strategic Development Director.
You're not going to pass it, Chris?
Sorry, my screen's, I was on the phone just
Okay.
barely got off. So I don't know who has gone and who hasn't.
Okay, so
I can pick it up. This is Jenna Gordy here in the planning office, taking notes for our office, current planning, and I'll pass it over to Emily Campbell.
Hi, all. This is Emily Campbell, Chair of the Grand County Planning Commission, and I am calling in. I'll need to drop in just a bit to go get my son, but I think I'll join y'all in person. So moving chairs.
okay. And let's go to Rochelle next. Rochelle Bradley.
Hi, Rochelle Bradley, planner with Bill over at SCJ Alliance, helping out in the background, here to take notes as well.
Okay, very good. Moab Folk Festival. I'm not sure who that is. Oh, Makeda. Is it Makeda? Okay, Makeda. Okay, very good. Okay, and I think that's everyone online, Jacques. You're muted. Jacques, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Let's move to the chambers. I'm having a hard time seeing it. It's a little bit small, but would those folks in the chambers please introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm the planner for the Grant County Planning and Zoning Department, Elisa Martin.
I'm Kevin Walker. I'm on the County Commission.
Sarah Stock, County Commission. Tricia Dean, County Commission.
County Clerk Auditor Gabe Wojtek.
Associate County Commission Administrator Quinn Hall.
Ryan Hunnings, Red Cliffs Lodge. Steve Walker, Live at Red Cliffs.
No, Steve.
All right, is that everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds like we got pretty good mic reception. I think somebody was saying the internet, and the kid was saying the internet's a bit slow, but I don't know if that's us or them. So at least we got reception. We know everyone, we can hear everyone somewhat clearly. I'm going to turn it over to Bill, and I think he's going to share his screen. And I think the first thing on the agenda on the first slide is kind of how we got to where we are. So he's going to be going through some scenarios here and discussing land use descriptions to some degree. There's a bit of background, a background document, which we call the community fact book, which was part of the RFP. That'll serve as a framework for background in the general plan discussion as we start redrafting it in the land use strategy. So it's an important reference point for background. And we've circulated it pretty widely throughout all of our contacts, including commission members. So if you haven't had a chance to see that, just let us know. There should be a reference, hopefully, on grandcountyconnects.com, which is our advertisement. Always go to grandcountyconnects.com. So this is a top-down approach. We make no hesitation about that. And it is going to be followed by a public engagement session, which will hopefully kick off this week in a positive way. They're always really great things to be doing. And then we'll be looking at implementation strategies and neighborhood planning over the next year and a half. Sounds like a long time, but really the goal is to go back out and do the grassroots exercise and update the public engagement strategy, especially, but also a lot of the other elements as we start moving forward, especially priorities and working together with the commissions on that. So we do have a fair bit of public outreach to do yet. That's the other shoe that needs to drop. Hopefully nobody's discouraged by that. It seems like we've got pretty good support from the commission members so far to keep going the way we are. Bill will be kind of filling in a lot of the background and how we've come to where we are with the data. And so I will turn it over to Bill, unless there's anything else, any other questions that anyone has, Jacques, at this point.
I'm just wondering where the fact book is.
Sorry?
Sarah was just asking about the fact book and if it's anywhere to be found. And I think it's been circulated once or twice, but I don't know if it's on our Grand County Connects.
Yeah, if it's not there, we'll make sure it's there by tomorrow.
I don't think it is.
Yeah, I also have not come across it.
Oh,
We should have that.
okay. Okay, well, we'll get it out there. Sorry. So it's a work in progress anyway. So over to you, Bill.
Great. Thank you very much, John. So when we kicked off this process early on, John said that we need to use a methodology called scenario planning, and it's different from what most planners use conventionally, which is more of a vision-based plan. And I'll talk here in a little bit why this approach seemed to make sense here in Grand County. But before I go much further here, I want to just mention that many of you will have seen some of these slides before, but I felt it important to maybe present them again and in a slightly different way as a foundation for the next steps that we're going to be taking in the process. So Grand County is somewhat unique in that 96% of its land area is either owned by or in the jurisdiction of somebody else. And so the county really doesn't necessarily have an opportunity to directly govern land use decisions going on in much of the unincorporated county land. And also Grand County is a creature of interdependent economies. A lot of what defines Grand County's prosperity is really from outside influences, whether it's people outside the area investing in real estate locally, or whether it's the market economies influencing agricultural goods or resource commodities. These are things that are extra regional and are beyond Grand County's direct control. And then also Grand County, just ecologically, it's in a place of environmental sensitivity. So a lot of the things that normally influence planning are outside of the immediate control for folks here in Grand County. And what we need to do here is develop a plan that gives you an opportunity to respond effectively. So what we're looking at here is really a distinction between what are conditions, what are those things that define the environment and the context within which you operate, and what are the choices that you make in response to what you are encountering. And so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to figure out a way that we can understand the distinction between what is a condition and what is a choice, and then also find a way to make sure that Grand County is anchoring its decisions and the choices it makes in the community's priorities and values. And scenario planning is a good way for us to go about doing that. One of the presumptions in scenario planning is that we will be encountering surprises between now and 20 years from now. And the whole methodology anticipates that there are limits to our ability to predict what it is that we're likely to experience on our journey. What it tries to do is it tries to give us opportunities, or at least a framework by which we can identify what we might look like in the next 20 years, and what kinds of changes we can expect over the next 20 years. And then it gives us the framework to begin to identify ways to measure that change or articulate that change. So part of the trick here is for us to figure out how we can apply factors that are relevant to the community and meaningful to the community, but also help us define and characterize the change that we're likely to see. Most of our planning work in the profession looks at a 20-year planning horizon. And scenario planning really drives home the fact that we need to look at this in smaller increments. Notably, we need to really pay attention between what's happening today and what we expect to have happen in the next 5 years. And this is really an important distinction, because we don't know where we're going to be in 20 years, but we have a pretty good idea where we might be in the next 5. And so what happens is that no matter how much our futures may diverge over the long run, in the nearer term, they're likely to stay somewhat aligned. And we use that as a basis for our action and prioritizing the policy that we come up with. And I'll talk a little bit about how we get there here in just a minute. So, and I'm glad someone brought up earlier the fact book, because one of the things that we have to really make sure we can understand when we're looking at a 5-year trajectory is to really understand where it is that we are today. What is our point of beginning? And then also to begin to understand what those issues or variables of community importance are so we can begin to articulate what the change might be using a vocabulary that's comfortable and accessible and intuitively understood by the community members. So this fact book, once you find it online, will give you an opportunity to take a look at some of just the basic demographics and environmental conditions here in Grand County today, but also importantly, some of what we discerned as takeaways on these various topic and issue areas that the plan must address. So we're trying to infer things based on the community preferences and what it is that we've learned, and then to translate that into a meaningful planning methodology here forward. So do take a look at that fact book. And I hope that you'll find it interesting reading. I hope you'll find very few surprises in there, but I'm also hoping that you'll find new ways of looking at some of those issues to help you get a solid footing on where we're taking the plan from this point forward. So I mentioned before that we need to find variables that make sense and are relevant to community members. And after going through initial study here the first several months of the project, we came up with 10. And these were based on our analysis in the fact book and also on the community interviews that the planning department staff did here early on. And so we broke it down into these 10 variables. And what we're trying to do is consider these more than just variables, but also anticipate that in the future they may be used as indicators as we start looking at how our guess at what the future may be is actually tracking with what we find as time passes. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to give us vehicles that we can use to monitor the plan's progress. And then also we wanted to identify factors here over which the community has little control. You know, these are things that are going to be describing what the future is that will visit us, not necessarily the future that we create as a land use jurisdiction. So earlier on, after we developed these variables, we created 3 different potential snapshots of the future. So in kicking this off, we imagined 3 distinctly different images for Grand County in the year 2040. After we did that, we also defined what we believed would be the optimal land use response to that particular type of future. So I think I just want to say that one more time. We tried to imagine a future, and we're demonstrating it here as scenario A on this pinwheel, and then identify a land use response that with all of those things considered in that future would be the optimal way that we could manage our land use in response to what we see. So we have this first one here, and if I needed to characterize this, I would say that this is a scenario that represents high land values and resource scarcity. Scenario B, following along the same lines again, describing a scenario and then figuring out a land use pattern that optimizes our response. This one is going to be based on population growth and investments in transportation capacity. Things like looking at expanding Highway 191 or making it easier to transit through Moab on the highway, whether as a bypass or an expanded arterial through town. And then we have alternative C, or scenario C. Again, these are creations of our imagination, where we've identified a future where we're really looking at climate change as a higher priority. And we're also looking at a resurgence in the agricultural or resource-based industry. So these are 3 scenarios, and these pinwheels are supposed to represent the degree to which each of these variables may change over time. After we defined those 3 scenarios and the land use patterns that we believed would be optimal responses to each, we went to the steering committee that's been working with us on this process and said, okay, so what do you think about this? And we provided them a framework. We said, take a look at these pinwheels, but also take a look at these land use patterns and tell us, A, what kind of land use pattern would you prefer, all things being equal? And then what kind of a future do you foresee for Grand County? And probably not surprisingly, what we saw was that their expectations over future conditions did not necessarily line up with the type of land use pattern that they would normally or otherwise prefer. So we saw that difference and that distinction between aspiration and expectation. And that's not unusual when we talk about planning. Our next step on March 3rd, and I think many of you who are here on this call also participated or at least attended our event on March 3rd, is that we asked community members who were there to talk to us about their expectations about the future. And so we gave them this one-page worksheet and worked with them through it so that they could begin to interpret how things like land values or investment in technology and investment in mobility and water scarcity and so on might actually play out over the next 20 years. And these became fascinating conversations. We had about 35 people visit our table. About 25 of them actually went through the worksheet exercise, but every conversation I found fascinating and informative. But we wanted people to concentrate first on how they would envision the conditions in Grand County. And then we started talking to them about ways that we can begin to position ourselves in terms of land use policy to be most successful, both to keep options open where we don't necessarily know what might be down the road, but also how we can begin to really act quickly on those things that are of greatest priority. So this was really a fun workshop for us. What we did is that we began to consolidate the responses, and we saw even more of a crystallizing that the future that people expect and the future that they want really is quite different. And we're trying to figure out now how we can make policy recommendations to close the gap. And the next few slides will talk a little bit about how we get there. But what we found is that the community was really able to recognize and accept the fact that what's likely to happen may be different than what they would like to have happen. And so we found that there's an acknowledgement that that gap exists and that we all have a certain degree of responsibility to help make sure that we're aligning our decisions to the extent we can to achieve the future that most people are hoping for. So this is an overlay of the various responses. So we can begin to see how the 25 or 27, I forget now exactly the number of the responses overlaid one atop of the other and creating this mosaic, I guess, or rows of responses to the various criteria. So our first approach to begin to make sense of this was to look at the mean values.
Bill, before you go further, so these responses were for what people wanted or what they expected? Which one are you showing?
Yeah, these are responses about what they expect.
Okay, thanks.
Right. So these are the factors beyond local control that people, I mean, maybe you can argue that mobility is somewhat within your control or at least within your influence because you can speak to the state and you can coordinate with the city. But what we were trying to do is understand what people would just envision for the conditions that will be here in Grand County in the next 20 years. So what we wanted to do here is take a look at the mean of these various variables over time. And we begin to see a pattern emerge, what the mean people would, well, or the nice people too, but the average of what people would expect to see Grand County face over the next 20 years. So this starts to take the shape of a potential preferred scenario where we tend to have a cluster of agreement over a future that represents these characteristics. Now, if we take it one step further and take a look at those areas where we believe there is maximum level of agreement, near consensus, then we start to see a tighter clustering of agreement on the degree to which things begin to change. This is an approach that's sensitive to the dispersion or the amount of disagreement on each variable and tries to identify those things where people are most likely to agree for each of these considerations. So yes, it's going to be a tighter wheel than the one on the previous page, but what it does is that it gives us insight into the maximum level of agreement, which means the safest basis that we can use for active policy initiatives. And this begins to be really important for us as we look to focus in our policy and implementation strategy on our first 5 years. So if we go by consensus levels of concern, then we start looking at factors related to land values, to tourism, second home economy, to water scarcity, to vulnerability to extreme weather events and population growth as the things to which we really need to pay the greatest degree of attention. Things like fuel prices or energy costs, the eventual future of the agricultural resource industry or investment mobility will generally take the course they're going to take, but don't necessarily seem to be held as an issue of high concern to the local community. Okay, so now we have something of an abstract picture of what the community might be hoping for and what they might be expecting. What we're trying to do here with our review of constraints is to begin to anchor some of those abstract principles into the more concrete geography and geology, the ecological condition of Grand County. So thank you to the state of Utah for having a wide variety of mapping resources from which we can draw. And what we tried to do in developing this composite constraints map, and you'll see some of the ingredients of this in the fact book, is to find ways that we could understand why we settled the way that we have in Grand County. And this confirms really that intuitive alignment that we find in developing the areas that have seen some development. It also drives home the fact that land, particularly developable land in Grand County, is scarce, even though the geography of the county is quite vast. And it also helps us delineate what might be our potential options as we look at development direction. This composite constraints map not only looks at things like property ownership and jurisdiction, but it also looks at terrain. It looks at environmental conditions like floodplain and potentially unstable soils and sensitive habitat areas, and create something of an overlay to reveal the areas where maybe we have the most latitude and flexibility in managing development into the future. So when we combine what the community was telling us with the constraints that we find on the ground, we come up with a preferred scenario. And this corresponds really to that mean scenario diagram, or that average scenario diagram that I showed a few slides back. Not surprisingly, it is a mashup of scenarios A, B, and C. What we found in conversations is that most people seem to be attracted to either a scenario A or a C future. Scenario A was one that was really focused on Moab and its immediate fringe. Scenario C was one that developed village-like rural centers. So people seemed just intuitively attracted to either of those, but almost exclusively people expected a future that was more like what we were showing in scenario B, where we have population growth and a concentration on mobility and congestion reduction. So what we find here with our preferred scenario is something that really does begin to bring the attributes of all three into a more coherent, unified whole. So we're looking at increased priority on policies that really do reinforce a Moab-centric development pattern, while also recognizing that Spanish Valley will continue to develop, and that we're also looking at creating facilitating the development of these more compact nodes in Mill Creek and Spanish Trail, their intersections with Highway 191. Second tier priorities are looking at what might become an activity node or activity center at Thompson Springs, and then in a more distant future, perhaps anticipating that one may also crop up near Castle Valley. And I see we have some Red Cliffs people here in the audience in that general vicinity. So when we look at Moab, we're looking at land use policies that would emphasize Moab's position as what's called a central place. It will be the center of government, institutional center. It will be the place where people go for the majority of their services in Grand County, and maybe even in northern San Juan County for the foreseeable future. Looking at opportunities to collaborate with the city of Moab to create opportunities for more intense housing types, more varied housing types, to help make housing more attainable and affordable for the people who are living in the area. And also collaborate with the city on defining a compact development form that's going to help with access for pedestrians and cyclists in Moab and the immediate unincorporated area around town. So less of an emphasis on building roads for cars and perhaps more of an emphasis on building facilities for all modes of travel. Looking at Spanish Valley, there will continue to be conversion of agricultural land into residential subdivisions. So we are looking at a more suburban pattern for Spanish Valley, similar to the way it has been developed in the recent past, and consistent with the way much of the valley area has already been platted. So not necessarily trying to fight the tide of residential conversion in Spanish Valley, but actually finding ways to perhaps manage it so it can achieve some higher level community objectives. And some of those things revolve around the treatment of land along the Highway 191 corridor, and also making sure that we're sensitive to those areas that may be vulnerable to environmental conditions like Mill Creek and some of the areas that may be subject to flooding or perhaps fire. So a major part of the Spanish Valley changing character is the development of these nodes, one at Mill Creek, one at Old Spanish Trail. The one at Mill Creek node is one that we're imagining would derive some benefit, perhaps, from development of the university there nearby, and be able to extend the character of the office, institutional, and residential development toward the highway, and create a compact commercial professional office node at the intersection of Mill Creek and the highway. We also see that there is quite a bit of an industrial or storage or light manufacturing landscape in that area. I don't know that change in that is necessarily immediate, but we are looking at ways that we can manage zoning regulations so that as it transitions out of that use, and it may, as property values increase, that there are design guidelines in place to make sure that development along the corridor near the node is compatible with the compactness of the node and is also consistent with some of the principles underlying the scenic corridor overlay, wanting to make sure that projects as they develop along the highway corridor are compatible with the dramatic valley wall backdrop, but also enhance the importance and functional capabilities of the nodes that they adjoin. The Spanish Trail node is a little bit different. Where the Mill Creek node may be a little bit more cosmopolitan, the Spanish Trail node is likely to be a little bit more village-like or neighborhood-like, where there would be a compact village center right there at Highway 191 and Old Spanish Trail. But it would be designed to really serve some of the more fundamental local needs of the community that's surrounding it. We are looking at a variety of housing types along the Spanish or in the Spanish Trail node, things that are perhaps apartments or condominiums or townhomes, but nothing that's going to extend too far into the Spanish Valley Rural Housing District. We are looking to find ways for more affordable housing to be created, particularly at this place, but then also to find ways so that as it develops, it reinforces and makes more vital a compact commercial node at the corridor. And I understand that as we're looking at this nodal development, close coordination with UDOT is going to be critical to make sure that interchanges and roadway facilities are designed and managed in such a way that they're consistent with the overall purposes of these land use strategies and their impact and ability to generate an active and attractive neighborhood. So looking at some of the other initiatives that we're seeing take shape here in the land use plan is a note at Thompson Springs. Now, I'm not sure that we've found yet an image to really capture what the possibilities might be in Thompson Springs. We're working on it. But this is a situation where we're looking at Thompson Springs really becoming an outpost type of a node where there is a certain amount of independence that is built into every fiber of this node. But we're looking also for an opportunity to expand the ability to provide services to locals and also take advantage of Highway 70 access to help build a robust commercial base. Now, we understand that any kind of development in Thompson Springs is contingent on the reliable provision of water. And so this is definitely not a first tier priority, but it's certainly something that we're thinking about, is that as some of those more technical issues are being resolved, how do we position Thompson Springs to really success and become a vital part of the overall Grand County fabric? And so we're conceiving with this more outpost feel to establish its independence and also a sense of character definition for what Thompson Springs may become. Now, I guess really in today's economy, there is no such thing as a true outpost. It's likely that people living in Thompson Springs will also be the people who are working in Moab and perhaps in the airport and other places in the county. So we want to make sure that this is still something that's accessible to folks who may need to be working or spending parts of their days elsewhere in the county. So if Thompson Springs is an outpost, then what we're thinking about for Castle Valley is more like a trading post. It's something that would be extraordinarily small in character and scale, but still also be able to offer some of the residents of Castle Valley and some of the others who are recreating along the Colorado River and aren't inclined to go all the way into Moab, access to some goods and services to support their livelihood or their transitions through Grand County. So again, that's nothing that we necessarily see as imminent, but it is an opportunity to begin to really celebrate that portion of the Colorado River drainage and take advantage of adjacencies to Castle Valley without actually being in Castle Valley and still provide services locally for the people in that part of the world. So John has reminded me frequently that we need to make sure we tie our land use plans into the tiered level of service scheme that the county has. And so this is our next step. As we're going through our land use strategy based on this overall concept and assigning these land use or level of service tiers to each area. The vast majority of the county is tier 1, which would be rural, the places where we're looking at minimal provision of services, maybe paved roads, maybe not, but certainly no water or sewer. Tier 2 are those places where we have water provision, but we're not necessarily feeling impetus to put in a community sewer system. And then tier 3 is really the more urban spaces, those areas along Moab and the fringe of town, and those areas in Spanish Valley or Grand Valley Water District. The Water District, thank you. Water District is providing sewer services, where the city of Moab is providing sewer services. So anyway, so we're seeing, if we were to break it down in nodes, certainly Moab centric, that space would be tier 3. Spanish Valley would be tier 3, where the sewer system services are available, and also in the Mill Creek and Spanish Trail nodes. Then tier 2 would be in those more rural areas of Spanish Valley, Castle Valley, Thompson Springs, and perhaps a suburban area east of Green River. And then the balance of the county would likely be tier 1. Open for your suggestions and ideas on that. I know there may be some impetus to elevate the status of the airport and Giants area into something that's a little bit more urban in context, but I don't know necessarily that we're ready to do that yet. Some of that may actually need to follow upon an airport master plan. We're also looking at the direct policy and zoning implications. Our world is policy. Lisa is working on the zoning stuff, and we're doing our best to equip her in that. We're building a policy framework, and you'll see that as part of the land use element. But we are seeing some fairly imperative policy moves that will address some of these more concrete concerns about the community. An early red flag for us came up on the issue of split zones along the Highway 191 corridor, and that we need to find a way to have a consolidated, consistent, and reliable response for what the development opportunities are along the Highway 191 corridor. And so within this overall context, we're actually looking at expanding the general commercial zoning designation, or at least the land use designation in those spaces, so that we do have an opportunity for some level of residential development along the Highway 191 corridor. But then also applying design guidelines. You know, there are ways that some of those scenic corridor provisions and principles can be incorporated in the zoning district, maybe in an overlay, maybe something that's actually in the base district itself. But we do want to make sure that if we are looking at enabling higher intensity development along the Highway 191 corridor, that we're doing it in such a way that's sensitive to the landscape. We're also looking at the high density housing and the overnight accommodations overlay districts. We're trying to find ways that those can actually be eliminated from zoning. And if we're able to provide both opportunity and control in the zoning districts along the Highway 191 corridor, we may be able to achieve that. I know, John, you were looking at working with UDOT about some of the design proposals for the 191 expansion, particularly the frontage roads and the interchange access points. We need to make sure we're keeping those conversations going and alive. And then also finding ways that we can integrate a variety of housing types. I spoke earlier about having a variety of attached family housing types like apartments, condos, or townhouses in the individual nodes, but also finding ways that we can have a reasonable and reliable approach to dealing with ADUs. I see that's on your agenda as well, and other perhaps non-conventional housing types, so that we can make housing affordable, increase its supply in the metropolitan area, and also be able to apply some levels of control for overnight accommodations and how those might impact our neighborhoods. So we're moving into a neighborhood planning phase now. John alluded to that earlier. What we're hoping to be able to do is to trot out some of these ideas to participants in the neighborhood meetings on Wednesday and Thursday, particularly looking at Mill Creek and Spanish Trails. I think those are some of the places where we're going to see the greatest degree of change, and see what the community's responses are. Confirming that our understanding of the various issues are correct, and then also giving John an opportunity to learn more about the scope of neighborhood planning that people are looking forward to. It's something that's really going to be defined in large part for what it is folks need, and then we'll come back to you, hopefully with the land use plan that's informed by these conversations, and also be a solid foundation for the neighborhood planning process that's going to go forward. Okay, John, I'll hand it back to you.
Hey, thank you, Bill. I think we probably need to do a roundtable here. You've got a couple of chat questions that I've seen here. I don't know if I missed anything. Mary McGann was asking about Castle Valley, whether they've weighed in. My response here, I think our response is basically that we're looking at the fringe areas around Castle Valley. I think Bill has called it Castle Valley, even though I think it's meant to be the area of Castle Valley.
Correct.
So it's the kind of fringe area development along the river, the access points that are there, the development that's kind of there already, and not much different than the fringe areas around the city of Moab, and or some of the collaboration that's necessary with the federal and state lands like SITLA as well too. So Bill, did you want to respond to that?
Sure. I was just managing my windows here, so I can actually see some of the chat comments too. So please help me stay on track, John. Yeah, Castle Valley area is what we're looking at, not necessarily trying to impose a new land use scheme inside the incorporated limits of Castle Valley or on its immediate fringe. That's really not what we were after. And some of the earlier conversations we had, actually back in November, were from people from Castle Valley, who indicated in no uncertain terms that they're really quite pleased with the way their community is managed and has turned out, and they're not necessarily looking forward to anything changing within their landscape.
That's the only chats I've seen, other than we have sent the fact book out to everybody, and it is on the Grand County Connects. It's a bit buried sometimes to find these things, but we sent that link. I think Rochelle sent that link out too. So you can find it in multiple locations now. So we look forward to your feedback. So maybe what I thought we would do, Jacques, if you're okay, and Emily, is to go to you as chairs and ask you for your first comments, and maybe have you just vet this roundtable with each one of the commissions. So maybe Jacques first.
Okay, thanks, John. First, yeah, thank you both for all your work on this. I have enjoyed participating through every step, and I am kind of just digesting the results. And the results of the scenario are about as I expected, and put down myself, but I don't really have any further comment right now. So I guess I'll pass it over to Emily. If Emily is on, she indicated that she might be on her way over to.
Hi, just can't manage mute buttons. That's my problem.
Okay. Thanks, Emily.
Hi, so I am joining from my phone, so I'll make this brief. First of all, I think it's a great presentation. We've been involved throughout this process. I don't have a lot to add as far as sort of directing the conversation. I do think it's interesting to see these nodes laid out, and I know that we've been talking about them, but it might be helpful to, I would recommend that we start there in terms of talking about the unique characteristics of those different areas within the county. I imagine that would be maybe a great place to start comment and to just frame the conversation less around like the overall vision, just because there's so many different pockets of different characteristics throughout the county. So that would be my suggestion, but John, I think you're probably maybe in a better position to drive.
Yeah, so one of the things you're not seeing yet, which is we're still in the middle, we're in the middle policy area because we're kind of moving to the node discussion and fringe area and some of the linear corridors, as Bill mentioned, the scenic corridors, and then design standards. All of those will percolate right to the land use code, by the way. So there are direct connections between development scenarios and entitlement and zoning. So it may not appear that way. The other thing that's missing still, which is coming, is the levels of service, how they're analyzed and how those translate into platting and subdivision. And that will be part of the land use code transition, as well as clarifying that within the general plan. And then the third part that's still left, which is fundamental, are the land use descriptions that need, Bill has mentioned some of those, like the mixed use, commercial development along, I don't know if you use those terms, but it's mixed use is residential and commercial together, making sure that those land use descriptions are a lot clearer than they are currently in the land use, in the general plan. And then service commercial, service industrial, where those locations are, they're hard to pick sometimes because they're impact related, obviously, and they'll impact residential too. So you can get mixed use with commercial and residential. Sometimes light industrial will mix well, but the heavier industrial will not. And sometimes retail outlets, commercial retail outlets are not a good mixture because of the noise that's generated. So it's noise, dust, basically, and fumes. Those are three big ones. Anyway, those land use descriptors still need to come. We've got some general descriptors that are in the current general plan for discussion, but Bill will be working together with staff and vetting that through the public and decision makers on what those land use descriptors look like and charting a way forward with them. Hopefully that helps. So Emily and Jacques, I was thinking that we should just go round table, and if you want to just do a round table, or do you want me to do that?
If you want to take that, that'd be great, John.
Okay. Okay, well, let's go to Mary, because Mary had a comment already. And I'm not sure if Mary is, because she came in there.
I'm still here. I'm still here, but my ability to talk is very limited.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to just listen.
Okay, so yeah. So any text you want to send Mary is helpful too. Okay, how about Evan?
Yeah, I appreciate this as well. I was just kind of simultaneously reading through some of the fact book. I was just getting that. But Bill mentioned some of the split zoning, and I think that that's one of the things where single properties have different zoning on different sections of the property, and then also kind of buffers around that. So like transition zones from highway, commercial, or whatever that may become to some of the more residential zones, and that's kind of a priority for me. And I was also kind of curious of where those thoughts or suggestions may be at now.
You want to take that, Bill, or do you want?
Yeah, I've got too many buttons to push here. Yeah, you know that I really appreciate that, and I was looking at that again today, and we have a condition on the west side of Highway where the ground ascends rather quickly up to the valley wall, and it's very visible from the highway corridor. And so when I think about a transition designation there, it's one where it seems like moving very quickly to a more rural landscape after you get out of the highway corridor is probably appropriate. On the east side of the highway, it's a little bit more obscure by whatever development may occur alongside of the highway. And so I was thinking that there may be a land use transition that is more intensity based there, going down a gradient from whatever is happening along the highway commercial district into the single family character of Spanish Valley, that it taper down and go through an intensity gradient on its way down toward Mill Creek or Old Spanish Trail.
And, you know, Evan, and for your benefit, we have been working with UDOT to some degree on their frontage road design, because that's so fundamental to the street character and design standards for that area, that we don't create this sea of paved area, which frontage roads tend to do. And sorry, there's a noise in my neighborhood here. And so we're looking at how we can kind of mesh that together with some of the design standards. We've actually been working with them over the last couple of weeks about some of that too. So that'll be a really important part of it, is how the roads work in the area, how mobility works in the area, and how the street presence of the built environment engages with the public street and the private streets too, for that matter. So let's go to, does that help, Evan?
Yeah, it does. And I think even closer in, like around the Holyoke neighborhood, when some of these, I think that there's actually a need for some commercial areas. I think that, you know, with hotels gobbling up so much of our commercial districts, there's not a lot of opportunity for smaller businesses. And so I want to be sure that we can preserve some of that and have some kind of mixed use, like you're speaking about, with residential and commercial together, but being aware of having the bigger projects kind of pop up in people's backyards. So having a little buffer there and kind of what that looks like, so that we can kind of launch some of these things that are in the waiting room and get them up and going. So yes, it does help. Kind of, I'm glad to hear that that's being thought about and is hopefully on one of the front burners.
There is a gateway reference in the scenic corridor part, which I don't think the county ever adopted, and it's embedded in the general plan on both the south side of 191. I guess we've got a number of gateways along the Colorado River, and then the north side on 191 too. So it's taking a look at potentially the longer term what that gateway entrance would look like. And I think the commission struggled with how that small area plan on the north side could take shape. So those are key parts too. Okay, I was going to go to the council chambers and maybe to Kevin Walker.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I guess I'm, you know, as I've said in past meetings, I'm particularly interested in how this, you know, the implications for land use code and all these things we're talking about. And I think once the conversation focuses around land use code, I think there's going to be a lot more meaty feedback. And so one comment is I just want to make sure that we start looking at land, you know, more specifically at land use code possibilities early enough in the process that there's time to incorporate feedback from the commission, the public, and, you know, go through a few versions of that. I hope it doesn't just pop up at the very end when it's awkward or inconvenient to maybe change direction. So just encouraging us to get to that level of specificity as early as possible. I do think, I mean, you know, I think the South Highway 191 corridor is important. And I think, you know, the nodes are part of that and the frontage roads. And so it feels like, I mean, I'm glad to hear that people are beginning to think about how that might go. Yeah, another important thing that I hope is an outcome of this is just where we expect to see increased residential density and where we don't. I think that's what we spend a lot of our time dealing with month to month and year to year on the commission. And you know, we don't want to have to be addressing those questions over and over again. We'd like to have a plan that we feel good about that sort of plots a path forward. Like Mary, I think this idea of something at Castle Valley, I'd certainly want to have, see what people who live in that area think about that. I agree that discussion of something at Thompson is maybe a little bit premature, so I'm glad that was in a different color font and something coming a little bit later. I do think, we've discussed those a lot at various locations, but I think talking about the intersection 191 with Mill Creek and Spanish Trail, those do seem like the two most sensible places to look at it. I'm supportive of that. So I guess I'll stop there.
So Kevin, any specific land use, you've kind of touched on a couple of them, any specific land use hotspots for you, like descriptions? The land use code reference, we'll get to that, of course, but what we're really looking at is the long range land use descriptors themselves and how the land use code would be embodied within that.
Yeah. So one issue that I think is relatively urgent is, there's sort of ongoing discussion with the state legislature about requirements for affordable or workforce housing, how much we can require, how much do the rules change if it's an incentive-based program rather than just an exaction. And I think there's a lot of advantage to incentive-based programs, and I think the county's HDHO program is a really great example of that, where we were able to embark on developments that have a really high percentage, 80% of workforce housing, something we would not have been able to do if we were taking a more straightforward exaction route. But in order for those incentive-based programs to work, the underlying base zoning has to be abundant enough that developers have an incentive. I think within the Moab City limits, the base zoning in like R3-4 is high enough that the incentives, relatively speaking, are not that attractive. So a lot of Spanish Valley already has like one house per acre zoning that's relatively sparse, and that leaves room for incentive programs. But along the existing zoning in 191 allows for very dense, unconstrained residential development, i.e. just a bunch of second home type condos could be built as a use by right now. And so I think we should look at maybe scaling that back and then having overlay zones to allow it to come back up to what it is now, but with some strings attached in the form of workforce housing. That's one example. And I think a similar approach throughout the county. I think we need to take a really close look at what's on the books right now in terms of use by right zoning. And I think maybe scaling that back a bit, but allowing ways for it to go forward in a more carefully planned way. And again, I think what we did with HDHO a few years ago was kind of shows the direction that could go. And so, more specifically, I think in our ranging grazing zone, we now allow one unit per 5 acres, which is basically Castle Valley density. So right now, if someone wanted to build another Castle Valley anywhere in the county, it's private land, they could do it and we wouldn't have much input. Maybe it shouldn't be 1 unit per 5 acres. Maybe it should be something larger than that. And then as part of some planning, more focused planning process, those things can be allowed to happen.
Okay, you getting that, Bill? Yeah. Okay, the other thing I was just going to throw in there, not that we want to dwell on your comments too much, Kevin, because we want to move on to, but workforce housing can have different built forms. One of them is camping, which could be more like not short-term camping, but more of that longer-term seasonal camping. What do you think about that as a land use descriptor?
I definitely think we should think hard about that and look into it. I think the devil's in the details, but there's been a lot of discussion about those kinds of creative, low-cost solutions to our housing crunch. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm on the commission to tackle that. But it just, the closer it comes to an actual detailed plan, there's just details to work through. But in theory, my impression is the county is willing to experiment with that.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Sarah next. I think Sarah's there, isn't she?
Yep, I'm right here. Let's see, I guess I'll just take this time to speak to my opinion about Castle Valley. I grew up out there, and I think there's this big piece that if the request for more commercial institutions out there isn't coming from residents of Castleton and Castle Valley, then it's coming for more tourist type gimmicky shops. And I know for the past 20 years or more, everyone out in Castle Valley has been weighing this question, like, is it worth the convenience for me to be able to get a jug of milk versus the possibility of commercial infiltration into that area and keeping up of the tourist mayhem that's happening out in that zone. And time and time again, through all the planning commissions and town councils, the answer has always been, no, we don't want more commercialization of that area. And the people in the town of Castle Valley worked really hard with Sitla to trade out all of that land that they held in Castle Valley because of fears of more development out there. They have scarce water resources as well. And so I think if we're talking about like developing a commercial node out there, it's coming and going to benefit one of two entities, which is Red Cliffs or Sorrel River Ranch, and more of that 128 corridor tourism development. It's hard to create a service that would benefit only residential folks while not bringing more people in, or like creating more development out in that area, which tourists also appreciate for being very rural and having that character. So I kind of think we should like take that off from the discussion because it's a detractor. Because I think there's these other big things that need to be discussed, like 191 and our high density housing, and even having that discussion about Thompson Springs. Is that are we gonna work on zoning up there? But I think residents of Castle Valley will probably come to the commission and say that they don't want that node and that we're probably just detracting from these other things.
Yeah, you getting that, Bill? I think we're getting most of that. Yeah. So more long-term residential thoughts rather than a commercial mixed-use node that could lead towards more short-term rental. I think that's what I'm hearing from Sarah. You got that right, Sarah?
No, I was not saying more residential development out on 128.
Not long-term.
We're going to talk about this later, where we propose the NCA boundaries, the National Conservation Area boundaries for the Public Lands Plan. But they're likely going to encompass that whole Professor Valley area. It's very scenic, and people come here to appreciate it for its rural scenic character. So I just don't think it's appropriate to develop out on 128. There are also constrained transportation issues and water. So all I was saying is that if you do put a commercial node there, it's difficult to service only residential uses. And it's likely to become some kind of touristy gimmick, even if it's just a general store outpost.
Okay.
And people aren't going to buy all of their groceries there. They're going to buy a convenient jug of milk. Sorry, I get a little heated because it's your hometown. It's my home.
Yeah, I think I'm getting, you're not as clear as you could be. I think I'm getting most of that. Bill, how about you?
Yeah, I think I do. I think I do understand. Yeah, part of that node was to, in some degree, recognize what's there now at Red Cliffs and the off rodeo, and just it's there, and to enable another dimension that would be convenient grocery or services available there too. But I also wouldn't see that as an immediate response. And it seems like something like that would be triggered to be incorporated in a positive land use element if there were a change in things like fuel prices or local sentiment, which might be derived from increased fuel prices, to allow for something else to happen a little bit closer to where people live.
Yeah, Bill, I think that's a good point, access to groceries and fuel costs and climate change and whatever. But I think that the correct answer, in my opinion, is to focus on something like public transportation. Create a little bus that people can take to the grocery store in town, because already people drive all the way to Grand Junction just to get cheap groceries. They're not going to be able to get cheap groceries at a weird tourist outpost general store. So it's, I don't know. It's not.
I jump in real quick here.
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Because we're on the topic of Professor Valley, which is the appropriate geographic name for the place that we're talking about here with that node. Castle Valley runs perpendicular to the river. Professor Valley runs parallel to it on both sides. Professor Valley is subject predominantly to state and federal land use planning, which has been completed as of 2008 for the feds and 2019 for the state. We want to make sure whatever we publish facing outward in its final recorded form is going to be consistent with the authoritative governmental land use plans that are in effect on the majority of land in the area. I would hate for another scenario where a developer comes in, buys a large parcel of private land that is public land adjacent, and then I have to go out there and do a site visit, explain to a gentleman why his plan is inconsistent with the law at the state and federal level, why we cannot build on the riverbed, and why we cannot put commercial corridors on sandbars and those kinds of things. So we want to make sure when we propose these things in areas like Professor Valley, which really are a couple hundred acres among millions of public acres, right? That they're consistent with pre-existing land use plans. That's something that we run into a lot with the existing commercial development in Professor Valley, continually reminding folks of what the context, what that land is, and what's happening out there. Like Sarah mentioned, NCAs, we also want to reiterate that the Colorado River there is eligible wild and scenic river corridor. The BLM and the state by proxy are required to treat it as such. So there's some things we need to not forget when we talk about that geographic region in a greater context. So just always plug in for other land use plans that already exist. That's me.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Yeah, we always want to tie in. We don't want to forget that. Good, thanks, Tony. So, and then Trish, we go to Trish.
Really like it if you wouldn't have me go after Kevin and Sarah.
I can't undo that.
Sarah's mad. I don't know if I've ever seen her this mad. I like it. I'm always mad. It's interesting because it's great to have Sarah's perspective, because Bill and I, when he was here, we talked about, anyways, there's this little store up in the Midtown Valley in Washington, and he talked about that store, and I was like, oh yeah, that would be perfect for that area. But how do you ever achieve that vision, right? As soon as you give somebody commercial zoning status, it's out of your hands, right? Like this general store that Bill and I were talking about, it's this cool little country store. The locals all have coffee there, right? It's got great, anyways, but also I'll state that tourists go there too, because I've been there and I've sat outside of that, out on the deck. So I see the vision, but it's like, how do you ever accomplish that? I don't know. So anyways, but I appreciate your perspective. The only other things I wanted to say, I think the nodes that you're envisioning in Spanish Valley to me make sense. Thompson, I think, is so girdled by its water issues that I love that there's passion out there and thoughts of development and how they want it to develop. I just don't see it anywhere in the near future. Like the MTRA project today, the email was, you know, like they're 5 years out of even considering giving over those water rights. So I think they're a long ways from having the ability to develop anymore. And just going along with Kevin, I think it'd be so nice to get to a point where we have density overlays to where every single time those things are coming to the commission, it's not an uncomfortable conversation, right? And this like, we're rejecting you. Instead, it's just like, well, it doesn't fit into our current overlays or current plan. Yeah, that would be great. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Trish. And we're going to run out of time here. So let's go to Josie.
Yeah, this has been a really great discussion so far. And, you know, I really appreciate this approach just in getting very specific about the kind of very different parts of the county and really how to be realistic about how the county comes together as a whole. Something that is kind of my immediate reaction to this process, and I know the kind of preferred scenario is like a conglomeration of what people want and what people kind of expect, whether pessimistically or cynically or not. And there's still part of me that really wants to plan to the vision as much as to the reality, if that makes sense. So, you know, a couple of my sort of specific examples of what that might look like is, I think in the Spanish Valley conversation, it just obviously seems like the place to expand growth, but at the same time, there is so much desire from that community to not do that. In fact, we overwhelmingly get feedback that people don't want growth. You know, and so I struggle with, do we just say, well, this seems to be the trend, and so therefore that's like law or that's nature, and so we just need to, you know, give in, or else we're, you know, pushing a rock uphill over and over again. You know, that's what I struggle with. And then also very much to the climate change and water scenarios, because for me, that just trumps everything else on that wheel. So it is also hard for me to kind of assume population growth when I'm not sure that we can handle it. So I'm just curious, you know, kind of how we bridge that gap between what people truly envision and want as far as the future of Grand County, and also what like very real natural parameters dictate, and what seem to be the sort of more human laws of, you know, market economics and things like that, that we might be like, oh, it's just easier if we work with that rather than against it. Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. I think one of the things about density, it doesn't have to be a dirty word. It is, because people don't envision it properly. I think that's one of the issues. The other one is people go to a rural area to be rural and they don't want to be urban. And but one of the tricks there in planning is, if you have services, normally that drives subdivision, and it drives entitlement. And there's been a lot of applications that have been turned down around that area for exactly the reason, because the land use strategies aren't there, or they're not long range enough. So one of the goals there is to actually develop good design standards, put density where it belongs, normally where the services are, including roads, and to manage water, to manage those services so that you have more efficiency with them, because those entitlements are already there, and those development and the rural sprawl will occur because the densities are really more rural sprawl than they are anything. So that's not an easy answer to your question, Josie. So I'm not trying to minimize your point, because I think it's a good one. But that's normally when we've done nodal types of development in the past. It's actually framing it in terms of what it could look like. The built environment is providing services that are conducive to the types of development that are there, and doing it over time. And that's really what a land use strategy is all about. So thinking through those policies and how they can all be connected. Sorry for the ramble there, but Bill, do you want to add anything?
I was just going to say, where the expectation and the aspiration aligns, That's your easy policy choice.
Right.
Where your aspiration and your expectation diverge, that takes a little bit more interpretation. And if you want to close that gap more toward the aspiration than the expectation, then that's an indicator for you that your policy has to be more robust and aggressive.
And am I correct in assuming that if most people preferred version A and C, that most people were not preferring sort of Spanish Valley development scenarios?
Correct. And I think if we were to lead solely on what people were expecting, we'd see policy initiatives that were less, as John was talking about, focused on nodes.
Right.
We really are trying to find a way to integrate some of those aspirational elements in there. It might not be there yet, but I think that there's a way that we can achieve some of those things. So I mean, where we do have influence as the county, this is an opportunity for us to put together our strategy to exert it.
Yeah, that's great. And it's a question as much as it's a issue. I wouldn't really say it's an issue because in thinking through that, I'm like, well, there seems to be a difference between like rural and agricultural character and the actual kind of need for regional food production. Those aren't necessarily always hand in hand, especially if most of our ag is, alfalfa fields and things like that. And, I kind of had a flash of Jackson, which I would not use as a prototype for us in most other ways, but I know that they have, some people trying like vertical farming and things like that, things that are less, resource intensive. And so, similarly, I see, John, just as you were saying, that there's just so many ways to, add density, and design really is key. And so I just really do want to make sure in this process that all of those things are considered so that we are designing for all of those things to be, kind of maximized at their potential for, saving resources and also like localizing agriculture, but maybe in a re-envisioned way for the 21st century. So thanks. That's all. I'll let somebody else talk.
Thanks, Josie. Okay, so with that, we'll go to Steve Evers next. Emily, is that okay with you, or how did you want to go ahead with the Planning Commission?
Steve, if you don't mind, I'd love to jump in real quick just because I made it out of my car and to the chambers. Sarah raised a really great point, which is that the solution to a need doesn't have to be building the need on site. It can be getting people to that place more efficiently and more sustainably. So, some sort of transit option along the river road is a way to get people to goods in a market with high gas prices, for example. I look at what's happening in northern San Juan County right now and the growth that they're expecting there. And if we anticipate that some residential development at scale is still attainable in that area, I'm very curious to see what they are doing. We don't control their futures. Ideally, we can partner with them. Can we look at ways to think of alternative ways to get people into the city center from places that are already developing, such as the South Spanish Valley, northern San Juan County, through transit options? When I talk to people, the issues that I hear come up are we need housing for our workforce. We need a way to get people to work. We need to protect our rural areas and our agrarian uses. And I just don't know, except for very, very specific point solutions, such as Spanish Trail Road, precisely, what type of growth Spanish Valley can support given those competing interests. And gas is going up. It's more expensive to get to work. We have a limited amount of land. So I guess my point, Bill, is I'd be curious to know when, and to Kevin's point as well, like how do we address this into the land use code? When does the conversation shift from building to planning for alternate ways of getting to similar solutions, including transit, including dropping down density, using density as an incentive for workforce housing versus just thinking about development overall? Like how do we bring that down to tactical solutions, and when does that happen?
I think there's a lot of good timing questions there too, and bringing people, it's a good comment, bringing people to services rather than the services to the people. And you really want a retail viable effort to occur, because you can't just put a store there and expect it to survive. You can if it's highway commercial oriented, I suppose, but those are really not the types of nodal stores that we're thinking of. At least that's one of the elements anyway. The San Juan County reference is a good one, and there are limitations both with us and with them, but more with them on the water services side of things. And there is a fair bit of collaboration occurring now, which is a bright light for all of us to work together on. That's more the technical evaluation, but the levels of service does include public transit. It does include, as you mentioned, water, sewer, stormwater management, hazardous lands, view corridors. There's a lot of constraints, and Bill was kind of touching on those. So Emily, we'll take your comments because we need to move on here, but anything you want in writing too, anyone that wants to submit anything in writing, obviously we're open to all of that too. So I'm going to go to Steve Evers next.
Great discussion. I really don't have anything to add other than I will say that I'm encouraged by, I think what I heard Bill say, or maybe it was you, John, just that proponent that prospect rather of something like a general business kind of as a land use or zoning being created and kind of embedding some of the HDHO overlay into that, or using that or revising that to kind of solve what HDHO and some of was trying to solve, because as we know that was controversial in the locations in which the overlay was created throughout the county for the the rural urban kind of argument, and I think if we can use what is currently highway commercial zoning to tweak that, put it into general business, so that way, maybe we can tweak the requirements for, or the allotments for residents. Maybe that's a good way that I don't think many could argue with, putting more housing for locals in the highway commercial, what is currently highway commercial corridor. So I just want to advocate for, I think there's some good potential there with what it sounds like, what you're working on there. And I'll end with that.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. And Makeda. Are you there, Makeda?
I'm sure she'd be able to contribute. She's at work.
She's at work, so she's
Listening in. Well,
okay.
I'm sorry, she's
Okay. And I don't think Rick's on the call. Emily, do you know? Is Rick there?
Rick is not here, so.
No. Okay, and then to Tony. Sorry, I know, but you already said a lot, Tony. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here, folks. I think my main point about pre-existing land use planning that might inform how development works in the Castle Valley, Professor Valley, whatever we want to call it. That was a little bit myopic, just that topic in that moment. Overall, I really liked this process and seeing how it unfolded. I liked how we pulled what people expected to see, which captures maybe a little bit of the tongue-in-cheek sad irony that a lot of the Moab locals have these days in the face of wanton development, gentrification, and climate change. We're not going to be able to develop any of these things if we don't have water. And I saw how water scarcity was very high up on the list. I really appreciated my colleagues' comments about preferencing transportation before building more and more brick and mortar. It's cheaper, it's more efficient. I don't know how we tackle the housing issue. I think if someone as simple as me could figure that out, none of us would need to be here, right? But I'm looking forward to see where this goes. I know it's not finished yet, so that's all.
Okay, well, we've actually come up to come up to the time here, Jacques. I'm not sure if we have a couple other people elected on here. Christina's on here. I don't know who else. Is there anyone else that's
I'm just
elected?
hovering. No
Sorry.
contribution.
Okay. Okay. I didn't want to forget you, Christina. You're important to us. And anyone in the commission chambers, anyone else, but I think that covers pretty well what we had. Bill, gonna wrap up?
I think I've gotten some great feedback, and what we've heard today will advance the conversations we have with the neighborhoods on Wednesday and Thursday. So I'm really appreciative of all that you said, and I really do also appreciate the nuance about the Professor Valley, Castle Valley space. And what that also indicates in terms of how we integrate more actively our transportation policy with our land use policy. You know, our focus is with this one on land use, but one of the other things that we're doing is we're building a comprehensive plan or a general plan wide policy framework so we can see how our land use policy interrelates with policy emerging in the plan's other elements. So I think that's a great illustration of the importance of doing that. And so we're going to look to it. Also, the nodal strategy is at its core a transit-oriented design strategy. And so we are trying to find ways to, at least with the land use development forces that we see taking shape in Spanish Valley, empower the advent of a public transportation system and give it a foundation where it can work effectively and efficiently.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Jacques, and first maybe as a wrap up, and maybe Emily.
I'm sorry, I missed that, John.
Did you want to wrap up here, or how did you want to? Because we're right at almost at 4 o'clock here.
Sure, I can adjourn. I'll adjourn. If does anyone else have anything to add before we adjourn? We have a couple of seconds left.
Say something?
Yeah,
Hi,
please.
From Red Cliffs. And first of all, I feel like I need to give Sarah a hug. I just want to say on behalf of Red Cliffs, we have no intention of developing any kind of commercial anything. Really, truthfully, our only thing, and one of the reasons that we're coming to these meetings is to actually clear up rumors. We came this morning for the exact same purpose, because there's all these, we're building a water park, we're building 15,000 seat amphitheater. No, none of that is true. The current owners who bought the place actually put it into a trust for their grandkids. They love it because it's rural and they want to keep it rural. Literally the only thing, and the only thing that we're going to be doing in the near future is building a better Moab Museum of Western culture and history. That's it. We want to make that a better experience because that museum sees 300 to 500 people a day come through there, and the space has outgrown its use. So literally that's the only plan that we have. We also, we want to look at building in a basically give back community component, which is through something that Steve is actually heading up, which is called Live at Red Cliffs, which is basically funded through the hotel and through a resort fee, where a portion of that goes into a fund that will create scholarships to help support the arts here in Grand County. So that's really why we're here. I'm a huge proponent. Workforce housing, huge. We can't open and do half of what we need to do because we can't house people. Transportation down 128 corridor, absolutely. Half the people that we want to employ, we can't get to us. And now, particularly with the gas prices, it's yet another example of why people will come. So just wanted to say that. Thank you for your time. Sure. Brian Hunnings, General Manager at Red Cliffs.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Yeah.
All right, it is. I have 4 o'clock, so I will adjourn the Joint Planning Commission and County Commission Land Use Analysis Workshop. Thank you, guys. Thank you, John and Bill, especially.
Okay. Okay. And the Planning Commission starts at 4:30.
So, commissioners, if you want to come in, now's your shot. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Elisa, are we ending the live stream and then starting again at 4:30?
Go ahead and end if we can.